The world felt cold and empty as Tyr clutched the last remaining memory of her father. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered a prayer to a father who would never return. Suddenly, the obsidian pendant in her palm began to pulse with a rhythmic dark violet light. The air around her vibrated with a power that felt older than the stars themselves. A deafening roar echoed through her soul, shattering the silence of the graveyard. Before her eyes, the smoke and ash coalesced into the form of a magnificent black dragon. This was Kamong, the ancient guardian who had been sealed within the pendant for eons. The dragon spoke without moving its jaw, telling Tyr that her wish for a second chance had been heard. With a surge of necro energy, the dragon wrapped Tyr in a protective cocoon of shadows. The sensation of time folding in on itself felt like thousands of needles pricking her skin. When the light finally faded, Tyr found herself lying on a bed of soft green moss. She looked at her hands and realized they were tiny, dimpled, and free of the scars of war. She had successfully traveled 7 years into the past, back to when she was only 4 years old. A sudden rustle in the nearby bushes caused her to scramble to her feet. Before she could run, a heavy rope snare snapped shut around her tiny ankle. Tyr let out a small yelp as she was swung upside down, dangling from a sturdy tree branch. A gruff voice laughed from the shadows, mocking the little rabbit caught in the trap. Basto stepped into the clearing, his massive hammer resting casually over his shoulder. Tyr glared at him, her purple eyes flashing with a spark of her former adult spirit. She realized she couldn't use her full power yet, so she decided to play the part of a lost child. She asked the giant man if he was a hero who had come to save her from the scary forest. Basto grunted, unimpressed by her acting, and began to sharpen a small knife. He told her that he was a mercenary and that nothing in this world was free. Tyr smiled inwardly, knowing that mercenaries were the easiest people to manipulate if you had the right coin. Suddenly, the ground began to tremble, and the birds in the trees took flight in a panic. Basto stood up instantly, his hand gripping the handle of his warhammer with white-knuckled force. A group of low-level goblins burst from the undergrowth, their eyes crazed by a strange purple haze. Basto swung his hammer in a wide arc, crushing the first goblin's skull with a sickening crunch. More creatures emerged, threatening to overwhelm the lone mercenary and the trapped girl. Tyr realized she had to act, even if it meant revealing a fraction of her necromancy. She whispered a forbidden chant, calling upon the spirits of the forest to aid her. Skeletal hands erupted from the soil, grabbing the ankles of the attacking goblins. Basto froze for a split second, staring at the undead limbs before finishing off the trapped monsters. With the threat eliminated, the skeletal hands vanished back into the earth as quickly as they appeared. Basto walked over to Tyr and cut the rope with a single swift motion of his knife. He set her down and asked her what kind of monster a little girl like her really was. Tyr dusted off her dress and looked him dead in the eye, telling him she was his new employer. She promised him more gold than he could ever earn in a lifetime if he helped her reach the capital. Basto looked at the pendant and then at the tiny girl, realizing this was no ordinary child. As they began to walk, a dark shadow watched them from the canopy, its eyes glowing with a sinister intent. A sudden high-pitched scream echoed from further down the path, sounding exactly like Tyr's missing father. Tyr froze as the scream ripped through the dense forest air. Basto gripped his warhammer tightly and gestured for the young girl to stay behind him. They moved toward the sound, their boots crunching softly on the fallen leaves. Instead of a monster, they found a group of wounded scouts huddled near a glowing rock. The scouts were babbling about a knight who had just vanished into a rift of light. Tyr felt her heart race, realizing her father might have been here only moments ago. Basto explained that to track such powerful magic, they would need official status and more allies. Tyr climbed onto a stump and declared they would form the world's greatest guild right then and there. She decided to name the guild Agavert, a secret word from her previous life. Basto laughed at the idea of a toddler being a guild master, but he bowed anyway. They traveled for 3 days until they reached the edge of the cursed valley. A strange vibrating sound began to shake the very earth beneath their feet. Suddenly, several medium-grade magic stones erupted from the ground like jagged teeth. Dark energy leaked from the crystals, twisting the nearby wildlife into monstrous forms. Basto swung his hammer, smashing the first creature into the side of the cliff. More monsters emerged from the shadows surrounding the mercenary from all sides. Tyr realized that Basto couldn't survive this many enemies on his own. She knew that showing her true power would change how the world saw her forever. The girl stepped out into the open and raised her small hand toward the sky. A cold black mist began to pour from her fingertips, freezing the air. "Rise," she whispered, her voice echoing with 1,000 ghostly echoes. From the ground, skeletal hands clawed their way out of the dirt to grab the monsters. Basto stopped mid-swing, staring in utter disbelief at the undead army appearing before him. A giant skeletal knight fully emerged, kneeling before the 4-year-old girl. With a single command, the skeletal knight charged, cleaving through the shadow wolves like paper. Tyr watched the slaughter with a detached, calm expression that didn't match her face. Within minutes, the threat was neutralized, and the magic stones shattered into dust. Basto took a step back, his hands shaking as he looked at the child he had been protecting. Tyr lowered her hand, and the skeletal knight dissolved back into the shadows. She asked him if he was going to leave her now that he knew the truth. The mercenary looked at his hammer, then at the small girl, and finally sighed deeply. He knelt down to her level and promised that a member of Agavert never abandons their guild master. Tyr hugged his massive arm, feeling the first bit of true safety in this timeline. They didn't have long to rest as a message bird arrived with news of a sighting in Pearl City. The message contained a description of a knight who perfectly matched Tyr's father. They packed their gear and began the long descent toward the coastal city. Tyr knew that Pearl City was a nest of vipers and corrupt nobles. She would have to hide her necromancy once they entered the city gates. As they approached the gate, she saw a familiar symbol carved into the stone wall. It was the mark of the organization that had betrayed her father in the first timeline. Just then, a carriage passed by, and a man looked out the window directly at her. It was him, but his eyes were vacant and cold, showing no sign of recognition. Tyr screamed his name and tried to run toward the moving vehicle. Basto caught her before she could be trampled by the crowd. The carriage turned a corner and vanished, leaving Tyr staring at the empty road with a shattering realization. Tyr dashed down the dusty road as the dust clouds from the vanished carriage began to settle. She knew that Pearl City was the only place that carriage could be heading. Basto and the rest of the Agavert Guild struggled to keep pace with the tiny girl's sudden burst of speed. They reached the massive ivory gates of Pearl City just as the portcullis began to groan shut. The city was alive with the scent of saltwater and the bustling noise of late-night merchants. Tyr's eyes scanned every face in the crowd, searching for the blonde hair and noble bearing of her father. Suddenly, a fanfare of trumpets echoed from the direction of the Grand Cathedral. A line of elite knights emerged, clearing a path through the throng of awestruck citizens. There he was, riding a white stallion at the head of the formation with unmatched grace. Tears welled in Tyr's eyes as she recognized the familiar etchings on his golden pauldrons. Disregarding her own safety, she broke through the line of guards and sprinted toward the horse. "Daddy," she cried out, her voice cracking with the weight of 7 years of loss. The white stallion reared up in surprise as the small child appeared suddenly in its path. Tessatan looked down from his mount, his brow furrowed in a mask of professional annoyance. He didn't jump down to hug her, nor did his eyes soften with the recognition she craved. "Whose child is this?" he asked, his voice steady and devoid of any fatherly warmth. Tyr froze as the coldness of his tone struck her harder than any physical blow. A guard quickly stepped forward to grab Tyr by the shoulder and pull her away. Tessatan simply adjusted his gloves and signaled the procession to continue moving forward. Tyr watched his back as he rode away, the realization sinking in that she was a stranger to him. Basto finally caught up and placed a heavy, comforting hand on her head. He explained that the Tsedan of this era had lost his memories during the Great Rift 3 years ago. Tyr realized that the father she loved only existed in the future she had left behind. However, a sinister purple aura began to swirl around her feet as her grief turned into resolve. She wouldn't let this version of her father die like the one in her memories did. She decided the Agavert Guild would become the shadow guardians of the Imperial Knights. Tyr used her necromancy to summon skeletal scouts to monitor the city's underbelly. The scouts soon discovered a massive cluster of magic stones growing beneath the cathedral. If these stones erupted during the tomorrow's coronation, the entire city would be leveled. Tyr led her guild into the depths of the cathedral to neutralize the threat in secret. They encountered high-level shadow wraiths guarding the core of the magic stone cluster. Tyr unleashed her full power, summoning a spectral knight that resembled her father's past self. The spectral knight carved through the wraiths with a single sweep of its massive ghost blade. With the wraiths defeated, Tyr placed her hand on the pulsing red stones to drain their energy. The stones crumbled into harmless dust, and the immediate threat to the city vanished. Above them, the coronation ceremony began without a single person knowing how close they came to death. Tyr watched from a hidden balcony as Tasitan stood tall and safe in the front row. She realized she didn't need him to remember her to love him or to protect him. The Necromancer King's daughter would stay in the shadows, rewriting history one battle at a time. With her guild by her side and her father safe, Tyr's journey into the past had finally found its true purpose.